Okay, so today we are looking at part one of chapter two and our transition from going to super endurance predators to becoming what is now known as the earliest civilized civilization. So it's a few things you're going to know after this. Some of the implications for not only what society was like, but also really their health after transitioning from being hunter foragers into essentially farmers, people that worked in an agricultural type of society. That's how they survived and became cultivators of plants and domesticators of animals. A major shift happened, so we'll learn about that of going from a more family and tribe centered type of life to the rise of city states. The role of sport and how it influenced power and even mating and hierarchy, and the role of sport in affiliation and identity. So where are we at? Let's get caught up. We've so far seen, up until now, what's been considered one of the ultimates in human adaptation. So being able to walk and move on two legs, which really turned us into these super endurance-based predators. We became not only a species that could survive, but become dominant. We were very mobile. We moved with our prey. So we migrated as prey migrated, and we also migrated to various types of plant-based sources of food. So we had a good variety in terms of what we ate of our diet, and we lived in family-oriented small communities. So these bands of about 25 or so people that maybe participated in some larger groups known as tribes, which we tend to see that 500 mark again. It was a very active lifestyle that was focused on survival, but it did incorporate leisure time because we know that those survival tasks, essentially of hunting and foraging, estimated to be about 20 hours in a week. And so remainder time could be spent in social types of settings, raising children, ceremonial types of acts within a tribe and group, and even some sports and physical activity. Then we hit what is called the Neolithic Revolution. And so when did this happen? Big range, but we know that around that 12,000 ago mark, between 12 to 3,000 years ago, we know this happened all over the world. And that has been debated a bit, we'll chat about in a second, but it wasn't just in one spot. And we changed. So we transitioned from this hunter and forager, survival-based, tribal, migrant, mobile type of society or small societies to what we now know as domesticated and civilized city-state lifestyles. So, where did this actually happen? And there's been some disagreement as we have gone through years of this of study. But really, we know that this happened in distinct civilizations that emerged independently yet at the same time. So I have this list here on the right. These are a lot of the forgotten places that where this emergence of this transition from hunter-forager into cities and into societies wasn't just in the typical reasons we hear of the Fertile Crescent. So we saw this in India, we saw it in China, in South America, and Mesoamerica, which is kind of known as Mexico and Central America, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we really thought it started, and maybe a lot of us had learned as we were young in school that it started in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates River, Fertile Crescent, Near East area. Absolutely, this happened here too. But this commonality we see, it's amongst spaces where the land was fertile for growing, for farming. And so that's where people tended to stop, basically literally put down roots. And interestingly enough, that's another phrase that we use all the time, can actually be drawn back to this era, to the Neolithic era, where people decided to stop and they started putting down their own roots and learning how to cultivate the native plants are in this area. So we also know, or we see that this Fertile Crescent area, we know that's kind of the Middle East that we think of now, and we also hear of Egypt as these common areas. Again, water is a very common theme for many of these places, not all. So basically what happened, this concept of upgrading lifestyles, and we need to know there's a little bit of a warning with this. If any of you have had a lifestyle upgrade, or if we think of someone, like as Drake said, started at the bottom and now we are here, there's additional things that you did not have to worry about at your old lifestyle that you do now. So we went from being mobile, always on the go, hunting, foraging, migrating. We exchanged it for a life of stability, putting those roots down. And so what we did, instead of moving to what we needed, we figured out, so we did evolve cognitively. This isn't a more advanced evolution. We figured out how to keep what we needed in one spot and produce more of it on command. And so how to cultivate. We had this domestication of food. And so instead of, again, hunting just whatever is there and moving to the food or moving to the plant life, and when it was able to be harvested at different times of year and seasons, we figured out farming, how to grow our own food. And so what that ended up was the learning how to grow plants and learning how to grow food wherever these people settled, these distinct areas. That was the type of food that was just naturally, successfully already growing there. And so that's what people learned how to continue to grow. And this really, if you think of it, is kind of the beginning of agricultural science, and even food science started here. And then also domesticating animals. So instead of hunting them and having them live in the wild and we have to go get them, we figured out how to have captive types of systems or controlled captivity so that we could still use those animal products, not just meat for eating, but also just for making goods and things that we needed. And really, this just happened to be, again, people wherever they were, again, at these times, they found these fertile spaces in their migration. And that's where they left. That's where they landed, which is what they were growing naturally. That's what they continued to cultivate. Something else that happened in the Neolithic area, there became a lot more of us. For various reasons, population growth skyrocketed. And again, a lot of that we can contribute to our cognitive advances, being able to communicate better, hunt better, forage better. That led to some initial growth. And then once we started this process of domestication and settling down and having more consistent food sources, even bigger population growth. And so really that was hard as populations grew. These traditional methods of surviving with intermittent food, with hunting and foraging, it was not a great or consistent way to provide for society. And we know that up until now, what the sign of a strong culture was and a strong society was staying alive and having births and having those young stay alive. And so that was seen as a huge sign of strength. This concept in hunting and foraging of periods of plenty and then going into scarcity and going back into plenty and back into scarcity, it wasn't conducive to this newfound population growth. And so that was a major factor. And so we do find kind of a cyclical issue because we had more consistent food. Because of growing it ourselves and staying in one spot, and the food was more reliable, the population was able to grow more. But because the population grew more, so grew that need to stay consistent and to grow more food and to grow what they knew. They did not have the most advanced system of diversity of growing food yet. It was pretty much what was there. But the population continued to grow because they figured it out. So this concept of upgrading, though, we have some new problems. So then they were nomadic, a huge variety in their food, very physically active because of having to track over long distances. We knew it was small tribal. We knew it was egalitarian types of society. So that meant a sense of equity among the different people within the bands and within the tribes. And whatever roles that they had in these survival types of societies, one wasn't necessarily better or worse than others. Excess was considered a weakness then in our Paleolithic or hunter-forager, because if you were constantly on the move, you wouldn't want to have a lot of belongings that would slow you down, a lot of wealth or excess, even excess food. You'd have to come up with ways to store it, and that would create issues when you're trying to transport it. There was no ownership, essentially, of what we think of land or property because they were constantly migrating. Oops. And now, over here on the right side, we see that here's some changes. So they settled, and they grew what they cultivated there, but that meant a decrease in some of their food variety. They had some more sedentary living patterns. And granted, this was by no means sedentary like how we know sedentary now. Farming was extremely hard work and having to create fields and basically begin the process of an agricultural community, extremely physical labor. So we do have to keep that in mind. It wasn't actually sedentary, but this idea of transporting themselves, traveling, locomotion, in that kind of sense over long distances didn't happen. Now there were very large populations, so hundreds of thousands of people as opposed to these groups of 500. And now a class system started to evolve because they had needed different types of cooperation than in the hunter-forager types of society where it was very survival based, had to be communal in order for anyone to survive. Now we're seeing different types of roles emerge because not everything is survival based. And we're starting to have some roles that are seeming to be more central and less essential. And so this is how this class system started to develop. And once we had that, this idea of excess, more food, actually claiming property, claiming land, that started to shift into from a weakness, something that held you back, into a strength. And so as individuals started to acquire things, more wealth or more property, because there are larger groups of people, maybe more notoriety, this is where really we see this convergence of class systems. So civilization, what does a civilized society mean? So as we see this birth of it, it's this shift to going from hunting and foraging to having a culture that's very systematic in how it does things. So instead of just whenever you need something, you go out and kill it or hunt it, there's a process, there's a system for how to do things. And again, that process or system of how we do things, it's not necessarily of right or wrong. It's more of just what's culturally acceptable. And we even see that now within different modern cultures. Their own system may work for them, but if you compare it to another culture, they may be unfamiliar with that particular system and so call it uncivilized or say that it is less or not as good as theirs. That has absolutely evolved into a lot of our cultural biases towards other groups, traditions, and practices that we see now. Okay, also with civilization, plants and animals used as food are domestically raised. So no longer hunted. Again, hunting still occurred, foraging still occurred, but it wasn't in this migratory type of pattern. Living was more sedentary in terms of where they physically lived. They weren't traveling. It wasn't these long treks, even though they weren't sedentary how we know it. Huge population growth, and this really, more people meant that they combined and made these huge urban centers, and we know them now as cities. Written communication developed. This was huge in terms of just cognitive development, and also record keeping developed. And not to say that hunter-forager or Paleolithic cultures didn't have record keeping, but written communication was not as developed then. So a lot of their stories and their folklore records, those were delivered through verbal, through telling stories of what happened. Now that we have written communication becoming more established, accounts of how things worked and how things happened and records of even like of wealth were kept track of now. And so because people could track things, they were able to acquire more. There was a huge surplus now. So we saw this food, it became known of having an excess and even other goods. And then when there is a surplus, that means you don't need it all. So you can trade for it or you can sell it. Buildings and architecture are also key components of civilization. So again, this concept of being in one spot, you put roots down, you need to have shelter instead of using the natural elements or using temporary shelter. And so people built buildings to live in and to show who they were and show their power. And then this is where we also see some intensification. I don't want to quite say doctrine quite yet, but the addition of religious practices were able to intensify with groups no longer as mobile as they were before and in one space. So we would see now religious centers would happen. And then political systems and other parts of social organization grew in this time frame. So again, we see this in hierarchies, these systems that needed to be made to have things run. Again, this culture of not just surviving anymore. Things changed. So this is the idea of going from survive, to thrive. And in this Neolithic city-state farmers, initially that was the concept. We saw huge amounts of growth. I threw the question mark in there because, again, with each new change, there's new sets of problems. So what made them different in these types of communities that were more city-state oriented? So these huge shifts, again, major shifts. We went from family and close small group identity to urban, and instead of identifying with your family or the band or the tribe you were with, you identified with this huge mass of people, a city, and this is what we do still today. We identify by our states, we identify by our countries, we identify even, again, like even the city we live in, the university we go to. So this is where this abstract concept of a state, an affiliation, was something that kind of came out of nowhere. It wasn't because of blood with a family. That's where we saw our traditional affiliation. It was just a group of people in a general area that maybe had decided to bring together this conceptual place. And so the concept of the state, and then having people become affiliated with it and to it, and the sense of power that went with that affiliation is different versus when it was associated with a family. That was not as abstract. It was very tangible if you were a son or daughter or cousin or sibling of someone. And with this abstract concept of a state system or state affiliation and power that went with it, because we're starting to see class systems form, we tend to see some issues now when we come into governance and blind compliance just to be known or be in a system versus previous methods of more council-based. So I don't want to quite use the word democratic. That wasn't quite understood yet, but in a tribal council type of situation, again, much more egalitarian society, issues were discussed with the entire group or a leadership of the group, and it was known as a communal issue or communal problem versus compliance to a law that's set by a very small number of ruling or a few people of ruling. And then this idea that survival made everybody important, and equal, these jobs emerged that really showed levels and showed classes. So in the new Thrive lives, this is what had to be dealt with. We had differences in our morbidities, so things that cost us to not live as long. So big major change. The growth and rise in incidence of disease, so communicable diseases. In these large, spread out, smaller groups, they were not fertile spaces for bacteria and viruses to continue to grow and spread among people because the groups were smaller and they moved constantly. But as these cities had these multitudes and masses of people, perfect breeding grounds for diseases and for even plague-like types of illnesses to happen that were not known previously. Different ways of this concept of making living. So we know that, again, before it was survival, just living was, that's what you did. But now we started to see these roles and even potential types of jobs. Diets had major changes. So with hunter and gatherer, yes, the food was harder to get. It took a little bit more work and it was not as consistency in the immediate in terms of acting or the act of being able to kill something. You couldn't just do it whenever you wanted to. You had to hunt it. But the positive then was they had a very diverse diet of plants, of animals, all types of things, and a very nutrient dense and nutrient balanced type of diet. In civilized society, food was more consistent, which is great, but there became excesses. And with excess, what we learned from before, bodies are still designed to be these hunters and foragers and designed to consume a lot of calories because we needed it initially to cross these large distances. So there was more of it. People were able to eat more instead of have periods of need. And the food supply was not as diverse because they weren't traveling to different types of foods. They were eating what was there and what they continued to grow over and over and over again there. And so this led to a major change in the nutrient profile and what people were eating. And that had major changes in your body. So if you know that if you change what you eat to more or less nutritionally dense, that's going to impact your health in some major ways. So a few things that we saw that happen then, what we've seen through archaeology, is the height of people decreased and actually continued to be at these lower heights, lower stature, up until the 20th century, so very recently. People were more prone to anemia, vitamin deficiencies, deformations with their spine, and dental issues. And then a shorter lifespan, people didn't live as long, which is very interesting. And what this can maybe be drawn to is we knew in hunting there was a lot of risk in the immediate, again, short-term sense, because there were some inherent dangers, but there, in terms of a work week, was not what it was. It wasn't the 60-hour, 80-hour, kind of like what we know now. They were able to have these great periods of rest. But as they transitioned to a farming society, if anyone knows what farming is like, that is not a short-term gig. It is all year round. There's various stages of working, and it's dawn till dusk. And so they had increases in their working hours in farming society. So people were actually working a lot harder over time and in cumulative effect. And so this also had implications on their health with a less nutrient dense type of food sources, and these longer and I would say more stressful types of lives.